You're listening to episode 110 of the Fed and Fearless podcast. On today's episode, I'm chatting with Lindsay Christensen about how to use nutrition to support Lyme disease recovery. So stay tuned. Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm your host, Laura Schoenfeld, a registered dietitian, nutrition business coach, and online entrepreneur with over 10 years of experience in online business. And I'm here to show you everything I've learned about creating a life and a business that nourishes you. On this podcast, we'll talk about the lifestyle habits, practical strategies, mindset shifts, and leaps of faith required to build a healthy body, a powerful mind, a strong spirit, and a successful business. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm your host, Laura Schoenfeld, and today we have a super packed episode, so I'm going to jump straight into this person's introduction. My guest today is Lindsay Christensen. Lindsay has her BS in Biomedical Science and her MS in Human Nutrition. She has successfully completed a 1,000-hour supervised experience program for the Certified Nutrition Specialist credential, an esteemed credential for healthcare professionals with an advanced level of education and experience in nutritional biochemistry and medical nutrition therapy. Lindsay enjoys working with a diverse array of clients. Her areas of expertise include nutrition care for complex chronic illnesses, including Lyme disease and CIRS, food sensitivities, and gastrointestinal health issues. Lindsay is an avid researcher and writer, and when her nose is not buried in the latest nutrition science and medical research, she can be found backpacking, skiing, and rock climbing in her beautiful home state of Colorado. So Lindsay and I have an interesting connection because, as many of you know, I used to work for Chris Kresser, helping him with his content production, particularly for some of his programs that he was running. And Lindsay actually has basically the job that I used to have, which is really cool to see someone who probably is smarter than me doing the work I used to do. And we talked today about Lyme disease specifically because that is really one of Lindsay's main areas of focuses. It's where she has put a lot of her attention and energy into creating resources, a group program, and really supporting people as best as possible through healing from Lyme disease. And as some of you may know, I think I've mentioned this on the show before, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease about 10 years ago and for sure needed to make some changes to my diet and lifestyle in order to feel better, which I definitely think 10 years later, I do not have symptoms of Lyme anymore, which hopefully proves to you all that it's possible to overcome Lyme, especially chronic Lyme. And Lindsay has so much great information to share about how to do that. So super excited to have her on the show today. She's also a nutrition business accelerator student. So it's been really great to help support her business growth, to help her launch a group program, which is always an awesome way to support people. And I was just really blessed to have her on the show to talk about nutrition for Lyme disease recovery. So without further ado, here is Lindsay Christensen. All right, everybody. Well, I am so excited to have with us on the show today, Lindsay Christensen. Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast, Lindsay.
Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. Well, this is a topic that we have never talked about on this particular podcast. And I actually don't remember if we ever talked about it on my old podcast, The Ancestral RDs. So this could possibly be the first time we're ever talking about Lyme disease on this show. And so just so our audience can get to know you a little bit better, what got you interested in helping people with Lyme disease?
Yeah. So really just my own experience with Lyme disease, quite a few years of it. I think Lyme disease used to be more of a niche topic, but in the years that I've been kind of researching on it and working with clients who have it, it seems like it's become much more of a common health concern, kind of coming to the forefront in recent years.
Yeah. And so is it something that you knew right away that you had it? Like I know, getting a diagnosis of Lyme disease can either be very fast or very slow, depending on the circumstances. So what was your experience like?
Yeah, for me, it was a very drawn out process. So, my challenges with what was eventually determined to be Lyme disease began about 10 years ago. So when I was kind of a senior in high school, freshman in college, started to deal with what I thought was just fatigue related to being a very busy college student. And that soon became clear to me that it wasn't quite normal. So I really had quite the journey. It took me about 4 years to get a diagnosis. So quite a long time with a lot of ups and downs along the way. So yes, definitely a journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I feel like from my experience, because as I was mentioning to Lindsay before we started recording, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease back in, I want to say 2012, and I was in grad school and I was having a lot of fatigue and just generally not feeling well. And it was an interesting process because I think most people assume when you have Lyme disease, you're getting like a bullseye rash or you see a tick or something like that. And I think for a lot of people, that's not the case, or maybe they had it, but they didn't notice it, or maybe they had it and they didn't realize it was going to turn into something that was more significant. And so I feel like most of the people that are struggling with more of that chronic Lyme are not necessarily people that got a diagnosis within, 24 to 48 hours of finding a bullseye rash or something, which unfortunately I think is what most people connect Lyme disease with.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. There's some really interesting research that's come out looking at that kind of quintessential sign of Lyme disease, which is that bullseye rash. I think it's unique just to Lyme, very characteristic of it. And approximately only 30% of people who have Lyme disease ever manifest that bullseye rash. And for some people who do have it, it may not even be obvious based on the color of your skin too. So we're learning that's really just kind of one sign of Lyme. Other acute signs like chills, a fever, people might mistake just for having the flu or something else along those lines. So it really can fly under the radar. And, even for people who live in like a Lyme endemic area. So at the time, I grew up in the Midwest, which is now recognized, especially the upper Midwest, to be a Lyme endemic area. It wasn't on any doctor's radar to look for that. So I guess it doesn't really matter where you live, unless you're kind of with a savvy doctor who knows what to look for. It, unfortunately, that diagnosis of Lyme can kind of slip by.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know how much has changed since I was diagnosed, so I'm sure you'll inform us, but I just remember that even back then, the idea of having chronic Lyme disease was super controversial, and even finding I'm sure they still call them Lyme literate MDs, was really hard, and the treatment was very controversial. And so I don't know if you would say it's any better 10 years later. I know, you were saying you had your diagnosis a while back. So being in it and being so, intimately involved with people who are being treated and all of that, do you think much has changed over the last decade?
I think amongst the Lyme literate doctors you alluded to, definitely things have changed. There's a lot more awareness, at least in that sphere of Lyme and the co-infections and the different ways that they can manifest. But there's also still a ton of controversy in the greater healthcare space about whether chronic Lyme is really a thing. I think the people who've dealt with it would definitely argue that it is, as with the Lyme literate providers. But the IDSA, Infectious Disease Society of America, still argues that maybe it's post-treatment Lyme syndrome that people are dealing with, or, a psychiatric manifestation as opposed to being kind of a true infection that may kind of be simmering, basically. So there's definitely still a lot of controversy there, which is really frustrating, but there's also a lot more advocacy, I think, amongst the Lyme literate healthcare provider space and among patients too. So that is definitely improving, I think.
Well, that's good. I remember, like I said, when I was going through it, I think there was one Lyme literate doctor in the area that I lived in. And it was even going to her was out of pocket. And
Mhm.
not to say that I always find health issues to be worth investing in. So it's not like I was like, oh, I guess it's, if I have to pay out of pocket, I'm not going to do it. But it was something that was a lot more challenging to get
Mhm.
support with. And again, there was a lot of controversy at the time, and probably still is, about what's the appropriate treatment. And,
Mhm.
and I don't want to go too far down that rabbit trail, but even just remembering the kind of treatment I was taking with like multiple antibiotics and antifungal and stuff. And then you start to question like, well, is the, treatment worse than
Mhm.
the actual infection itself? So it was a very interesting experience. Sometimes it's weird to think back because it's like, a lot of times I forget that was part of my health history, just because it seems like it kind of went away on its own, which that makes me question, was it actually Lyme that was causing the problem? So lots of questions in my own mind about that experience. And that's not to say that I believe it's not real. Of course I believe it's real. It's just one of these things where it's like, I think it can be, depending on the person, how it'll be like, all they have is a hammer, so then everything's a nail, if that makes sense. So I think it's really important that the people who are dealing with it, are led correctly and appropriately by their healthcare providers. So all of that said, for somebody who may not have been diagnosed with Lyme, because like we were saying, I think it's, you find a tick or you find a rash, it's like kind of obvious. But then for most of those other people that don't have any sort of visual sign that they were bit by a tick, I don't think most of them are going to know that quickly that they're dealing with Lyme disease. So what kind of symptoms would somebody need to be looking out for if Lyme could possibly be indicated?
Yeah. So, over the shorter term or a more acute situation, those flu-like symptoms tend to be pretty common. Sometimes people will have rashes, like other than that bullseye rash that appear. Sometimes those can be related directly to Lyme or even to the co-infections. Some of those co-infections like Bartonella or Babesia will have like a characteristic rash. Fatigue would be a big one. And then for some people, even like relapsing fevers more over the acute term. And then as symptoms kind of shift into that longer term phase, all sorts of things can happen. So cognitive dysfunction tends to be a big one, brain fog, inability to focus, just like becoming easily mentally fatigued. Mental health issues would be a concern as well. There's actually a lot more research that's really quite fascinating coming out, looking at, they refer to it as Lyme neuroborreliosis, aka that means just like Lyme infection of the brain and all the symptoms that can happen with that, like anxiety and depression and brain inflammation. Some people will develop cardiovascular issues, which can be quite serious. And then I think kind of an underappreciated set of symptoms that can happen. The Lyme literate doctors, many of them know this, but it's not so well known, in the greater healthcare sphere, would be gut issues, really stubborn gut issues. Some people will, all of a sudden have gut problems, like constipation or bloating or, indigestion that they didn't have before. And then I guess, some other even longer term things would be, the HPA axis dysfunction, formerly known as adrenal fatigue. That can be a thing. And I'm sure we'll get to this later, but things that I see amongst my clients with Lyme disease in my clinical practice would be things like food sensitivities that kind of pop up out of nowhere, or unexplained weight gain tends to be a really stubborn problem for many people. So kind of those longer term symptoms can really run the gamut. So, and that's probably part of why it's so hard to diagnose, because it can look like just about anything else other than an infection.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like a lot of the things that people would be experiencing are not necessarily issues that the average medical provider would be tying to Lyme, right? I mean, even just, I laugh because I work with so many functional medicine nutritionists, dietitians, that kind of thing, to help them create like online programs and things to help serve their clients better. And we're always looking to figure out like, why is somebody not getting the help that they need with certain issues? And even things like digestive issues or fatigue, there's so many times where people just get brushed off as like, oh, it's just IBS, or, oh, you're just stressed, right? It's like people just get that kind of response to these symptoms, and there isn't that deeper investigation. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask you about what symptoms could be related, because a lot of times and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of times the reason why people even get diagnosed is because they're looking for somebody who might diagnose them. Like they're already kind of suspecting it and they're looking for it. It's not often that you would go to a doctor that's going to be like, you might have long-term Lyme disease. Like, oh, that's why I'm having food sensitivities. Like, I don't think that's most people's experience. Is that what your experience has been?
Yeah. I mean, usually the person that's seeking or ultimately gets a Lyme diagnosis kind of has done their research and knows what they're looking for. There's some helpful tools out there, like the books by Dr. Richard Horowitz that have some surveys in there that are just, really helpful tool for somebody who, if they suspect this might be an issue, it can kind of give them a starting point. Yeah, but other than that, it can be kind of like this murky condition where it's hard to know where to look next if you kind of haven't done some reading and research yourself, which is unfortunate and frustrating for people.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when people are dealing with a mold toxicity issue, because there's so many similar like overlaps of symptoms that people can be experiencing, and most doctors are not thinking, oh, you should maybe see if mold's an issue. So a lot of times it's up to the patient to really be an advocate for themselves and know, hey, if you're, you have these issues and you've been working at trying to get them better and they're not getting better, there might be some other things you need to look at. And I think Lyme is definitely one of them.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if since you're not a doctor, feel free to take a pass on this question, but I'm just curious because this could be helpful as well. When somebody's getting diagnosed, what is the actual criteria for a Lyme diagnosis? I remember back when I was diagnosed, it had to do with I think it was like IgM or IgG bands on certain, I forget the exact numbers. I feel like number 41 comes to mind, but I don't know if that's changed at all or if it's the same, but is that something that you are comfortable answering, knowing that you're not a doctor?
Sure.
As a little asterisk there.
Yes. So I can't speak super eloquently to that, but I can say or speak a little bit to the standard tests that are ordered. So, in the conventional healthcare space, if your doctor agrees to test you for Lyme, sometimes they'll kind of dig their heels in about doing that. But if they're open to doing that, the tests they would run would usually be the ELISA, ELISA test, and then a Western blot. And if a certain number of markers, basically, put it simply, on those tests are positive, like you mentioned, like IgM, which is going to be more indicative if that's positive of a recent infection. If a certain number of those markers are basically met, that criteria for Lyme diagnosis can be met. The problem is there's some issues with those tests, in terms of how accurate they are. And for somebody who's maybe been dealing with Lyme for kind of under the radar for years, those tests are going to exponentially decline, in terms of their utility. So that's a situation where something like an IGeneX test may be more useful. There's all sorts of different labs, fortunately, nowadays that are going to be more helpful for identifying those kind of latent, longer term infections. But yeah, those ELISA and Western blots would be used kind of up front. And just back to that bullseye rash, actually somebody can get a diagnosis of Lyme just through that because it's so characteristic. So, that can be a reason enough for a doctor to put somebody on a round of, the antibiotic doxycycline initially for Lyme. So I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm I know I got all the typical testing done, but I don't remember. It's the one area that I totally forgot, because it's not something that a lot of people were bringing to me necessarily as part of their work with me as a nutritionist. So I also didn't know if the testing had changed in the last 10 years, because I just remember back then it was so controversial, and there was certain, I forget if it's the FDA or who has a certain, FDA doesn't seem to make sense. Maybe it was the CDC. I think it was the CDC that had a certain there was certain things they needed to see in order to even count it as a Lyme diagnosis. Because I guess the CDC, one of their jobs is, as we know now, to track, endemics, pandemics, that kind of thing. So they want to know if somebody's got Lyme, where do they live? How many people are getting it? So I think that was part of the challenge, is that the CDC, the way that they count Lyme isn't always the same way that it can be found. And so I know that was something that was an issue 10 years ago. I keep wanting to say like, when was that? It was a decade ago, but it sounds like maybe some of the testing has gotten better. And I would imagine a lot of that testing has to be done through some kind of functional provider. Is that right?
Yeah. So it would need to be done, through your MD, or in some states, a naturopathic doctor could order some of those tests, like an hygienics test too.
Mm-hmm. Is there any test that can be ordered for yourself? Because I know sometimes you can, there's lab options that you can order labs yourself. Is that an option for Lyme testing, or do you always have to go through a doctor?
To my knowledge, it needs to go through a doctor usually. I'm sure maybe somebody will correct me out there, but that's
if you know of a reliable test that somebody could order for themselves, let us know. But I wouldn't be surprised if they would require it to go through a doctor, because it is kind of
it's very hard to interpret too. There's a lot of nuance to it. So I feel like it really is something that it's best to have the trained eye of a professional look at it.
Which, to be fair, I think most labs could fall under that category, but I know there's certain labs that, like, you can kind of order your own blood work for certain things. I didn't know if that was available for Lyme testing. So what would be some of the most common myths that people are typically believing about Lyme disease? I think we probably covered one, that the bullseye rash has to happen for it to be Lyme disease. So what else might be something that people commonly believe that's not true about Lyme disease?
Yeah, I think another common myth is that it's simple to eradicate. The IDSA referred to earlier seems to kind of think that. And for some people that may be true, especially if the infection is caught early on and antibiotics are implemented rapidly and it's the right antibiotic. For some people, it can be possible to, stop that infection in its tracks and prevent it from becoming this bigger deal. But for somebody who's been dealing with Lyme or co-infections for a longer period of time, it becomes a lot more complicated to treat. So it kind of becomes more of like the long game, in terms of, turning around somebody's health, treating that infection. Part of that has to do with how complex the bacterium is, or one of the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. There's multiple varieties of it, basically, but it can actually change its shape to evade antibiotics. It can create this kind of non-proliferating form that can hang out in the body for a long time and then activate, spontaneously or down the road. It can create these biofilms. We often hear about that, like in the context of the gut, but this little sneaky bacteria can do that itself in various parts of the body. So it's pretty interesting. It's a smart little thing that can cause a lot of havoc in the body. So it's not so simple to treat necessarily. And I think that it's definitely a common misconception. And then I think, another thing that I see more along the lines of when I'm working with clients is that, you just do, I see this myth of you just do the medical treatment and then you're good to go. I think antibiotics and pharmaceuticals absolutely have a place, but in my experience, I also find that the nutrition and lifestyle pieces are really crucial for getting that sustainable, long-term type of recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I would imagine that, especially based on how evasive the bacteria is, that even, the antibiotics that work may not fully get rid of an infection, right? So you're going to have plenty of opportunity to share with us all of these nutritional strategies, but I would guess that part of what can make or break somebody's recovery is going to be the immune system functioning and whether or not their immune system can actually handle the infection, or if it's kind of like the infection is too much and the immune system either is overwhelmed or, there's so many different reasons why somebody's immune system may be suppressed that it's like it may just not even be responding the way it needs to. And then the infection, the bacteria can kind of do whatever it wants. So is that kind of one of your main focuses, is helping people's immune systems function appropriately?
Yes, absolutely. And it's not just a matter of like, quote unquote, boosting immunity. In many ways, it's more of a balancing act that needs to happen, because that the bacteria that causes Lyme can do different things to the immune system, kind of allowing it to escape the immune system's recognition. So I'm sure we'll get to this, but like one of my top priorities in working with clients who have Lyme is trying to, perhaps not surprisingly, reduce inflammation so that the immune system is not distracted by creating this like unproductive inflammatory response and can really hone in on, the things in the body like that infection that are truly a problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's shift gears then, because I feel like I want to get to your expertise. I think this was helpful to set the stage for people because not everybody is versed in Lyme, and this might be the first time somebody's even hearing about this as being something that they might need to be thinking about. So I'm glad that we had the opportunity to kind of set the stage, and we can shift into the nutritional side of things, because like you were saying before, I think it's really easy to assume, oh, just go take these like 6 antibiotics and be on it for 3 months and that'll be it. And, I do think when I look back, if I was going to guess if, let's say I did have Lyme, because again, I'm like, okay, I had the testing come back positive, but in my mind, it seems odd that it would just kind of go away, right? Like it felt like it was a problem for a while and then all of a sudden it's not a problem anymore. So I do think if it was Lyme for me, I'm guessing my lifestyle was either supporting my recovery or exacerbating my recovery. I mean, I was in grad school. It was a stressful time. It was not exactly like, my best years of self-care. So I do think that it's possible that if it was a Lyme disease issue that, the antibiotics may not have been able to really take care of what my body naturally could have done by itself if it was just supported appropriately. So what would be some of the common nutrition problems that you see when people are coming to you with Lyme disease?
Yeah. So like I alluded to a second ago, trying to get chronic inflammation under control is really essential. A lot of the clients I see are so well informed already. They've done a lot of that legwork. And just to give an example, I would recommend limiting those most common dietary inflammatory triggers that probably many of us have heard about. So of course, like the refined sugar and flour-based foods and our industrial seed oils like soybean oil and corn oil. But I do also find that we need to go above and beyond that in many cases with people who have Lyme. So I'm often advising doing a trial elimination of gluten and or dairy products as well. I feel that those are really 2 common food sensitivities I see in practice. So really trying to remove kind of those lowest hanging fruit in terms of dietary factors that will cause inflammation. And then after that, like you mentioned, that optimizing immune function is really crucial. So I'm also working on, optimizing dietary nutrient density and trying to get all of those nutrients in that we need to quench inflammation and support the immune system. I may talk about this more later, but I do also see a lot of just food sensitivities, even beyond the gluten and dairy piece, not in all my clients with Lyme disease, but in a number of them. And I have some suspicions that is a function of some of the disruptive effects of the infection, as well as potentially a result inadvertently of some of the, antibiotic usage and things that have to take place. So, all that is to say, I'm like initially trying to clean up inflammation, bring out the fire hose nutritionally and get that down to create an environment in the body that's going to be more conducive to the immune system functioning the way it should.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would imagine that with those food sensitivities, there's probably some level of, significant gut permeability going on that a lot of times food can either create or heal, right? So it's like, I'm sure you're helping them make sure that the food that they're eating is healing for gut permeability and not exacerbating it, which obviously removing gluten's generally the first step there to hopefully reduce some of that permeability. But it's interesting because we've had conversations about food sensitivities on this podcast before. And I think even that, I don't know if you see this in the Lyme community, but a lot of times the response is just pull the foods out, right? Like just totally remove anything that you're sensitive to. And that's what's going to fix the issue. And in fact, it's probably related more to like malnutrition and infectious issues, that kind of thing. So do you see that a lot with people coming to you that they've just like pulled a ton of foods out of their diet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I've had more than a few clients who've been down to like 5 foods that they can eat. And honestly, I was there too, probably like 8 years ago, I was down to like 5 foods I could eat at one point because, every food that I perceived a reaction to, my perspective was just remove it. And I think, while it maybe served some beneficial purpose for like the first week or two, it wasn't, the right course of action to take longer term. So, many times that those clients who are coming in to see me already very restricted, one, we're needing to work on those underlying factors that precipitate food sensitivities like the leaky gut situation and malnutrition, and then work on, incrementally expanding the diet, because that's going to be crucial for getting in all the nutrients that are needed for healing.
Yeah. Do you find that people are typically removing foods because they literally have a reaction to them, or are there approaches to Lyme disease out there that are encouraging limiting diets?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. People really in general aren't at like a lack for information on the internet. So, I have clients who have done tons of research themselves, and then they come in and they're on a low histamine, low FODMAP, low oxalate, paleo diet, and they have, almost nothing left.
That sounds like it would be carnivore, basically.
Basically, yes. Would be
carnivore with very fresh
yes.
proteins, right?
Yes. But then they go read another Google article that tells them to be vegan then for paleo. So it's like a no-win situation. So I think part of it is like genuinely a reaction or reactions that they're experiencing to food. Little side note there, some of the immune cells that are harnessed by the immune system to try to address infections like Lyme are called mast cells, and they can secrete histamine. So like that molecule will be associated with like an allergic reaction, as well as other mediators that are inflammatory. And we have a lot of them in the gut. So one of my theories about what can be happening when people with Lyme develop some of these food sensitivities is that they may have a lot of those immune cells, trying to do a job in their body, but maybe reacting, more to foods than they should. Just a theory. And then I also do get clients who, have read things on the internet about what they should or shouldn't be eating. In general, I won't, name names or point out websites or anything, but in general, I find that most of my clients with Lyme disease do well on an omnivorous diet. So I tend to be pretty like upfront about that, especially, maybe we'll get to this later, but especially with people with like the blood sugar issues and HPA axis or adrenal issues. I find that omnivorous way of eating in some cases seems to be essential, but at the very least is really supportive and can make a big difference. And in my own experience, I was, not to demonize these diets, but was a vegetarian and then a vegan when I was at my worst point with Lyme disease. And my first doctor I worked with wouldn't work with me unless I added grass-fed beef in. And I remember having that first little grass-fed beef burger that my mom made for me after a couple of years. And it was like my brain turned on again. So I do like to share that with people. I work with people who are vegetarian and vegan, so I'm not opposed to working that way, but I do find that omnivorous approach appears to be really helpful. So yeah.
Well, and I would imagine, just if we're thinking about immune system and gut support, there are so many nutrients that are very difficult, if not basically impossible, to get from a fully plant-based diet. Like, I just think about the two that come to mind would be preformed vitamin A and zinc. And I know technically you can get zinc from plants, but it's a lot harder to get it from plants because of the fibers and the phytates and everything. And then preformed vitamin A is literally not in plants. So, hopefully people that follow me know I'm kind of obsessed with vitamin A, and it's something that I've talked about for a long time. But vitamin A is something that will affect gut permeability. It'll affect immune system regulation, both like calming down an overactive immune system and bringing up a underactive. So, I do think when anyone's dealing with some kind of immune system related issue, it's like, again, not saying it's impossible, but it's really handicapping the ability to heal because of the things that their body needs that are difficult or impossible to get from plants.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, people don't need to go on a carnivore diet to meet those micronutrient needs, but yes, like the vitamin A and zinc are going to be crucial. And particularly for for everybody, but for people who are dealing with the cognitive, issues related to Lyme and also the mental health issues like anxiety and depression, it can be a bit of an uphill battle trying to get through that stuff without having bioavailable B12 in your diet and our other B vitamins. And I even talk about cholesterol, like dietary cholesterol with my clients as well, because we need that to support our brain function and create hormones and things too. And we're really, only getting that from animal food. So I think there's definitely a healing role for those foods in a diet that's going to help with Lyme.
Yeah. And it is one of these things where I think if you're Googling, right, there's going to be lots of different opinions about what to be eating and different reasoning behind it. I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily a Lyme thing, but I know there are people who can become allergic to red meat from tick bites. I don't know if you see that in your clients at all.
Yeah. So that is alpha-gal syndrome. It's kind of this emerging issue where people develop an allergy to red meat. So that includes like all mammal-based meat products. And basically the reason that appears to occur is that when a tick bites you, it transmits this little carbohydrate molecule called alpha-gal for short. And your immune system should ideally create a reaction to that carbohydrate molecule to then target the bacteria. But weirdly enough, that carb molecule is also found in red meat. So that kind of immune response can, interestingly, help you fight the bacteria, but also make you develop an allergy to red meat, which stinks. So, some people may not be able to consume red meat as a result of that. And it appears to be modifiable over time. I think the research is still kind of murky, but I have some clients with alpha-gal syndrome who have been able to slowly reintegrate some red meat over time as they've been making their way through their medical treatment with their doctor. And we've been usually, working on gut health repair at the same time too.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about this to be confident, but I would imagine there's a chance that gut permeability would make or break somebody's reaction, right? Because if it's, I don't know how big of a chain it is as far as the carb is concerned, but if it's a larger chain carb, if you're digesting your food appropriately, by the time that molecule might get into your bloodstream, in theory, and I could be totally wrong about this, so nobody write this down. Don't take this as gospel. But in theory, it could be a situation where if your body's digesting appropriately, that alpha-gal may not even end up in the bloodstream in that form anymore, and then your immune system wouldn't be responding to it. So that maybe could be a reason if people's gut health is doing well, that it could not be a permanent condition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really do wonder about that. And hopefully some scientists will research this more because, it would help to understand what are the risk factors for somebody who might develop this. It looks like people who have a history of allergies may be more susceptible to developing this alpha-gal allergy. But I think it also, always comes back to the gut too, and anything we can do to try to improve that, reduce that leaky gut situation will ultimately be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. So why is nutrition something that someone with Lyme disease should be putting time and energy and effort into? How would it affect their recovery from Lyme disease?
Yeah. I view nutrition as kind of creating this foundation upon which to build or rebuild, if you will, your health after having dealt with Lyme. So, like we've talked about, we need to have good gut health in place for our immune systems to function properly. I think, 70 to 80% of our immune system hangs out in our gut. So we need to have that in place. I think, you can layer on all the treatments you want, but if that gut isn't healthy, it's going to be an uphill battle. So, and diet tends to be one of the most significant influencers of our gut health. So I think nutrition is crucial in that way, for supplying those nutrients that support immune function. It's crucial in that way too. Those nutrients don't come out of the ether. We have to get them through our food. So that's important. And then I think, we need to optimize our nutrition to help, get ourselves off of that mental health, roller coaster that many people experience, and to get our brains functioning again. All the foods we eat are going to have a huge influence on that as well. And I think from the fatigue perspective too, which is such a common symptom of Lyme and in many cases can be quite debilitating, how we're eating, whether somebody's eating in a way that supports their blood sugar regulation or not, or supports their HPA axis or, adrenals for short, is going to have a huge impact there. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, there's so many different systems impacted by Lyme, and food can impact all of those systems. So, that's in short why I think it's just really, really crucial.
Yeah. Well, and this might be a little controversial, but this is something that I think was at least relevant in my experience. And you can tell me if you feel like you see this. Sometimes I think when people get diagnosed with something like Lyme, that's their focus. And they're all about, like, again, the medications, the supplements. Oh, I'm going to get a sauna, like all the different things that are like Lyme treatment focused, but they don't realize that their food and lifestyle choices are actually either making things worse or possibly actually the issue itself, right? Like, I mean, you were talking about HPA axis dysregulation. There's people that develop that because of their food and living habits, right? And so my point is not to say, oh, Lyme is nonsense and everything we just talked about for the last 30 minutes is, it's just wrong, right? It's like, I think Lyme definitely exists and it definitely causes problems for people. And having worked with a lot of people in that like orthorexic, like, disordered eating kind of tendencies, if you over-identify with that diagnosis, not only are you possibly doing things like, a vegan diet or something like super malnourishing because you're avoiding all these foods, or, you're super stressed all the time because you're like worried about, oh, what if I do something that's going to make the Lyme worse and then that's causing a problem. So it's like, I do think sometimes people's behaviors can either, I think very clearly exacerbate the issue or possibly be the actual cause. And yeah, maybe they had Lyme and maybe that was something that would have gotten picked up by a test, but it's like, is that actually what was causing the problem? Or were you living in a way that was actually not good for your overall health? And it just like was easy to pin it on Lyme kind of thing. And the only reason why I bring that up is because I question it for myself. Like, was that really Lyme, or was I wasn't living a very, supportive lifestyle, not only from like, I was eating quote unquote healthy, but it was like low carb. It was like, I had all these food restrictions because I was like paleo this, paleo that, right? Like it was kind of causing my own problems by being restrictive for no reason, wanting to lose weight all the time, probably over exercising, being super, busy with schoolwork. And I think I was working was I waitressing at that point? I can't remember if I was still waitressing, but that was not a fun job. So that was like the physical impact. And then when I think about my mindset around life, myself, like my identity, how I, saw myself, like self-esteem, that all probably was not great for my physical well-being either. So I only bring it up again, not to say that people should not look into this if they think it's a problem, but also to just remind people that like sometimes, we want to go for these like exotic diagnoses when in reality, sometimes it's like our daily habits and the way that we think about ourselves is actually creating half of the health problems that we're experiencing.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I think there's definitely this element of like the terrain and the infection. And this is just my anecdote. So not like you said, not disregarding the fact that Lyme disease is a thing, but I made huge strides in improving my health through the diet and lifestyle piece before I even did like really consistent medical treatment. For one, because I was so reactive to everything, I just, I couldn't tolerate more than a few days of a medication or an herb. And I finally just kind of like threw my hands up in the air and decided to focus on the nutrition and lifestyle factors. And that helped me calm my brain down and my nervous system, allowed me to get my gut health into a, not yet perfect at that point, but a more tolerable place. it allowed me to actually, aside from nutrition, but like get some joy and pleasure back into my life too, which I think I needed in order to get into more of a healing state. And then once I'd improved that terrain, I was able to more effectively address the infections. And, our nutrition and our lifestyle are those factors that are going to really affect the terrain. So somebody who, may still have an active infection could be, feeling better than somebody with, less of an infection, quantitatively speaking, who's not doing all the nutrition and lifestyle related things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like I said, the reason I brought it up is because I always feel like it's this tendency, especially in that super health conscious space, to be like, I got to find the diagnosis, then we got to treat the diagnosis. And it's like losing the forest for the trees kind of thing. And whether or not it's actually caused by Lyme, like your lifestyle has to change to support it. And so I just know I almost had the opposite experience as you. I was on all the the antibiotics, the antifungal, I had this like really nasty like herbal tincture that Chris Kresser sent me this and it was very generous of him. He sent me this like giant bottle of these herbs. It was so gross. And I was like choking it down. And I think like a few months in, I was just like, I feel exactly the same. What is the point of this? Like I'm probably destroying my gut with all of these antibiotics. And I think eventually I just like stopped doing any sort of treatment for it and was just like, maybe this is my life and maybe this is just how it's going to be. And again, I don't really remember because I'm trying to think back, like what was the transition? Like what happened? Because it was just like all of a sudden I felt normal. And who knows, maybe I just have been slightly tired for my entire life and I wouldn't know the difference if, maybe I never got rid of it. But I do think for me, it was, I think it's very likely that it was my lifestyle that was causing a lot of that fatigue and that the Lyme was like, it was there. I must have gotten bit by a tick at some point if I had the marker show up, but I don't know if any of the medical interventions did anything. I'll never know. Obviously, I'll literally never know, but I think this is kind of a plug for getting your diet and lifestyle in order. Because again, sometimes you don't realize like that could be 90% of why you don't feel well. Like if you're, and I hate to, drag vegans, but I'm like definitely not into a vegan approach for anybody. But, if somebody's on a vegan diet and they're like B12 deficient and, have all these like gut issues because they're eating a bunch of like dried fruit for their meals and stuff. And it's like, oh, I'm bloated all the time and I'm exhausted and my hormones are all jacked up and, I have like terrible gut pain and it's like, oh, let me go get tested for Lyme. It's like, let's make sure we're actually looking at some of the stuff that could be causing that, regardless of whether or not someone has a Lyme diagnosis. So I just wanted to point that out because, it sounds like you feel similarly about making sure that it's not actually your own, diet and lifestyle choices that are creating the problem. But I do think that could be a relatively common issue. I certainly saw a lot of people that might have been causing at least a good significant component of their symptoms, if not possibly the bulk of it being like, and this wasn't just a Lyme thing. This was a lot of different, sometimes you see too many functional doctors and you get a lot of different diagnoses and it's like, maybe you just need to eat enough calories. Like that can make a big difference, right? If you're under eating for 5 years, it's like, amazing what kind of impact that can have when you're actually giving your body the calories it needs to function. So I always want to make sure people are seeing the full picture. And again, if they need Lyme treatment, obviously like that's going to be an important part of their recovery, but to not just go straight into either the medical model or even the functional model where it's like 8,000 supplements that you're on every single day.
Yeah. And I would say if you're going to go on those 8,000 supplements, at least make sure you've got your bases covered too, in terms of the nutritional lifestyle pieces. And there's definitely people I've worked with who've had all those bases covered and they clearly need that antibiotic treatment or the herbal treatment. But more often than not, it seems to be a combination of those factors. And, our Lyme literate doctors are swamped. They've got a lot of work to do, a lot to keep track of. And I think, part of why nutrition seems to be kind of missing from that conversation is like a factor of time for them. And then, in the greater health space, that's a whole nother story why nutrition has been emphasized. But
yeah.
more often than not, it really does seem to be that combination of things. And, try to get those nutrition and lifestyle bases covered.
Yeah. Well, I can say from experience, it's a lot harder to support somebody through a diet change than it is to give a bunch of supplements, right? I mean, it's like, and even as a patient, to take a bunch of supplements versus to change your habits. A lot of these habits are ingrained in decades of beliefs around health or around yourself, like even the under eating thing. I mean, I can't tell you how many women I worked with that thought, oh, I should be eating 1,800 calories a day, even though I'm active. Like just these beliefs that people have that in and of themselves cause horrible dysfunction when done consistently for a long period of time. And it's like, working with somebody through that takes a lot more hand-holding in a lot of cases than just being like, here's your supplements, go buy them at the front desk and come back in a couple months and we'll see how you're doing, right? So, and that's not to say, again, there's value in that. And it's not, I'm not denigrating functional providers. It's just a lot of times if you go to somebody who's more of that medical or even naturopathic focus, they don't have the time to walk you through the diet changes and deal with like the beliefs and habits that come up that get in the way of making those changes. So my belief is that if anyone's dealing with any sort of remotely lifestyle related issue, that they should work with a qualified nutritionist, but I'm a little biased about that one.
Yeah. And I mean, some of the other factors that come up in Lyme, like just feeling overwhelmed easily or being exhausted all the time or being in pain, that adds some additional, obstacles or hurdles that need to be navigated in, that journey to get to a more optimal diet. So yes, it's, not something that like, handing somebody a PDF handout is gonna necessarily accomplish. So that can be a good place for people to start. Oftentimes I'm working with people who've gotten that handout and then they felt more confused than before and, realized that they needed some more guidance because food isn't simple. It's not like, it's not like following a dosing schedule for supplements or a prescription. It comes with all these beliefs and whether they're true or not, and like all the life aspects of life that overwhelm and everything. So it can definitely be difficult to navigate, but definitely doable, definitely worth it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know you have a few resources for people that can help make it easier to navigate.
Yeah. So I guess the first place I would send people with Lyme who are looking to maybe learn a little bit more about my nutritional approach is the free ebook on my website. It's my Lyme Brain ebook. So basically covering foods and nutrients that are really important to emphasize for, supporting that cognitive function and mental emotional well-being, which I feel like in many ways is like a stepping stone to all the other nutrition changes that should ideally take place. So I have that. I also have a tangible, book you can hold too, called the Lyme Disease 30-Day Meal Plan. And that's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Target, probably a few other places too. And then I have my website as well, where I post blogs pretty regularly and people can reach out to me there if they want to.
Awesome. I love it. And I think with meal plans, it's always nice if people don't have to think about what am I going to eat, right? Because if you're dealing with brain fog and fatigue and stuff, it's like just making a decision about what to eat is like stressful. So if you can kind of take that out of the equation and know that you're nourishing yourself appropriately to help your body heal, that I think that can take a lot of stress off people's plates. So I'm very excited that you have that resource for people.
Yeah. I've gotten good feedback on it. There's good recipes in there. Yeah. And it's, straightforward, kind of takes some of that brain work out of having to figure out what to eat. So,
awesome. Well, Lindsay, it's been so awesome chatting with you about Lyme disease, about what it is and how to diagnose it and how to know if it's something that you need help with. And, on the flip side, how to know if your diet and lifestyle are contributing to how you feel or if they're helping you heal. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom. Is there any last words of wisdom that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah. Well, I touched on this earlier, but I would say, don't wait forever to address the nutrition and lifestyle piece. I know it can feel overwhelming and it can feel like, it makes more sense to just focus on just the medical treatment right now. And while that's crucial, don't wait to get those other pieces in place. Your food and the inputs you're giving your brain and body through your lifestyle are going to have a really huge impact. So yeah, make it a priority.
Yeah, always. Well, thanks again, Lindsay, and thanks to those of you for hanging out with us for the last 45 minutes or so. And we will look forward to seeing you here next week on the Fed and Fearless podcast. Take care, everybody. Are you a nutritionist or dietitian struggling to figure out how much to charge for your programs and services? Maybe you've heard that as a nutritionist, you should just charge what you're worth. But this way of thinking can cause you to either undercharge your clients or work yourself into the ground trying to earn your worth. As a healthcare provider, you can't set up a pricing structure that forces you to sacrifice your own health and well-being in the name of your business and your clients. But I promise it doesn't have to be this way. When you download my free profit planning workbook, I'll walk you step by step through the 10-step process for determining the right pricing for your nutrition business. As a nutritionist, you have the power to completely change someone's life for the better. There's huge value in that, so it's time to stop underselling what you do. By following along with this worksheet, you can determine exactly what you need to charge to achieve your revenue goals with ease. I'll teach you everything I've learned about pricing from growing my own nutrition business to over $250,000 in revenue annually and helping other dietitian and nutrition entrepreneurs hit their first $10,000 to $30,000 months and beyond. To get your free workbook, go to lauraschoenfeld.com/profit, PROFIT, and grab your copy today, so you no longer have to wonder how to set the right rates for your incredibly valuable nutrition services. That's lauraschoenfeld.com/profit. It's time to make the money that you deserve as a nutritionist, and I can't wait to help you get there.